invaded from Nubia, Egypt's southern colony, and for the first time in history, the two countries' roles were reversed. Egypt, the old master, was conquered. In 1150 BC, a familiar power was about to re-emerge: the gods' wives of Amun. They were high-ranking women from Nubia. Before the new black pharaohs could continue their conquest of northern Egypt, they had to secure the sacred southern city of Thebes. The Nubian kings cunningly resurrected the position of God's wife. They bestowed the title upon their daughters with the hope of expanding their own power. But over time, the women transformed their religious power into political position and usurped the very rule of the pharaohs. At the Medinet Habu burial complex in Thebes, Egyptologists are now understanding the extent to which God's wives wielded authority.
The most important of the gods' wives are buried here at Medinet Habu. These were very, very powerful women who represented both political and religious power. They ruled Egypt as kings. These women were from Nubia, from what is today Sudan. And under their rule, they reunified Egypt and ushered in a period of renaissance in arts and culture and politics that lasted for over 500 years.
The location of the God's Wife chapels from this period are an indication of the power these Nubian women possessed. Across from an earlier monument, constructed by Pharaoh Hatshepsut, and along the processional route to a temple built by Pharaoh Ramses III, the God's wife, Amenertis, built her funerary chapel. But the true measure of her power was in the chapel courtyard, where she was depicted in the tradition of gods and kings.
The fact that the gods' wives really ruled as kings is very evident in these scenes from their tomb chapel at Medinet Habu. Here we have Shepenwepet, one of the gods' wives, before the gods Re-Herakti and Isis. And here it's very clear that she is the same height as these gods. And this is extraordinary because people who are not kings or queens will be shown shorter than the gods. Another symbol of the rulership of these women is here. Here is a representation of Amenertis, another of the gods' wives. And on her forehead, she wears the snake. It's called the uraeus. And this is a symbol of royalty. Another indication is that her name, Amenertis, is here encircled in a cartouche, in an oval. And this is, again, a prerogative of kings and queens.
The gods' wives were frequently depicted wearing the double feather crown, a royal headdress that symbolized authority over the two kingdoms of Egypt. Inside Amenertis' temple, archaeologist Emily Teeter discovered further evidence of the gods' wives' kingly power. Here, Amenertis presents offerings directly to Amun, an honor usually reserved only for the king. And in two similar scenes, Amenertis offers sacrificial bulls to a statue of Amun, while devotees offer sacrificial bulls to a statue of the god's wife herself. The iconography suggests the status of the gods' wives was equal to that of the gods. For the next 600 years, from 1150 to 525 BC, the gods' wives were among the most powerful rulers on earth. But unlike the gods' wives that had gone before, these divine consorts may have been celibate. Egyptologists have pointed to hard evidence that the reigning god's wife passed on her title to an adopted daughter. Descriptions of the adoption ceremony still survive. The god's wife and her attendants went to the temple of the sun god Amun with offerings. There, the attendants tied amulets and adornments onto the new wife, anointed her with oils, and placed the two-feathered crown of Egypt on her head. She was then proclaimed God's wife, hand of God. With this ritual, the adopted daughter completed her transformation to God's wife. However, the mummy of Ma'at-Kare, a princess living around 1000 years BC, found in Deir el-Bahri, has long challenged the theory that the gods' wives were celibate, as she appears to have been pregnant at the time of her death. In the mummy laboratory at the Cairo Museum, doctors Salima Ikram and Nasri Iskander examine Ma'at-Kare's remains.
This is the mummy of Makare, from the dynasty 21st.
She's been mummified in the typical 21st dynasty way, with having all the organs returned to her body. But what's interesting is that she looks as if she was pregnant, and that would have been a great scandal for someone who was supposed to be a celibate god's wife of Amun.
In addition to looking enlarged around the abdomen, buried at her feet was what appeared to be the mummy of a small infant. Dr. Iskander believed that Ma'at-Kare violated the code of celibacy and died in childbirth. He took x-rays of the two mummies to investigate the theory further.
So here's the x-ray that you took of the baby.
Yeah. Look what we have here. It's a baboon.
It is
not a baby, not a human.
It's her pet baboon, and it's beautifully mummified. Look, it's all been eviscerated, every bit of it, and it's got stuffing in it, so it looks like a nice shape.
It's not a human.
The infant mummy was probably a favourite pet of the young god's wife. Ma'at-Kare's pregnancy was the work of an embalmer who overstuffed her. Despite their findings, the Ma'at-Kare mummy episode did not throw further light on the issue of celibacy. One thing is for certain: the last and most infamous god's wife, the world's most famous femme fatale, was not celibate. Cleopatra.